Take out your Bibles and turn with me to Psalm 77 as we continue in our study, the songs of our faith. Psalm 77 is a powerful song. Last night it was so funny. Somebody came up to me and said, Steve, what I really love is how every time you start a new song, you say, this is one of the best ones that we're looking at, because they're all so good and they're all so fresh and powerful and practical in our lives. Psalm 77, another one of these songs in the collection of the songs written by Asaph. And in Psalm 77, Asaph writes, I cried out to God for help. I cried out to God to hear me. When I was in distress, I sought the Lord. At night, I stretched out untiring hands, and I would not be comforted. I remembered you, God, and I groaned. I meditated, and my spirit grew faint. You kept my eyes from closing. I was too troubled to speak. I thought about the former days, the years of long ago. I remembered my songs in the night. My heart meditated. My spirit asked, will the Lord reject forever? Will he never show his favor again? Has his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed for all time? Has God forgotten how to be merciful? Has his anger withheld his compassion? And then I thought, to this I will appeal. The years when the Most High stretched out his right hand. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. I will consider all your works and meditate on all your mighty deeds. Your ways, God, are holy. What God is as great as our God? You are the God who performs miracles. You display your power among the peoples. With your mighty arm, you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. The waters saw you, God. The waters saw you and writhed. Their very depths were convulsed. The clouds poured down water. The heavens resounded with thunder. Your arrows flashed back and forth. Your thunder was heard in the whirlwind. Your lightning lit up the world. The earth trembled and quaked. Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were not seen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. And it ends kind of abruptly. It almost feels like it's unresolved or unfinished. And yet, in this song, Asaph communicates the secrets of how to thrive even in the most difficult times of our lives. Now, as we're looking at this psalm, as we do with all of the songs we've been looking at, there are some observations that make this song important and special. 3 that I'll share with you. The first is, with all this in this 10-song collection that we're looking at, they're all written by Asaph. And the challenge is that the original Asaph was appointed by David to be a worship leader when Solomon built the temple. But still, hundreds of years later, generations later, there are songs written by Asaph again. And what we find is that his descendants, who were also worship leaders at the temple, were writing songs, and instead of calling themselves the sons or descendants of Asaph, they all simply write with the name and attribute it to Asaph. So it can be one of the early ones that was written by the original Asaph, or it can be hundreds of years later by one of his generational descendants. As we're looking at this song, we know it was written by somebody in this group, and it's not one of those national songs representing what's happened in all of Israel. It's very personal, very intense. But as we're studying this song, there's absolutely no hint, there's no indication of when it was written or what the circumstances were. There's no way we can date this song. We just know that this was written by somebody who was going through a very difficult personal experience. And because of that, the second observation, this song has 2 completely opposite and dynamic tones to it. The first half is all despair, not just encouragement, absolute despair. But then the second half, starting at verse 10, takes us equally to the opposite side and represents a song of hope. And so we see these contrasting, dynamic moods that are both represented in the song. The third observation that makes this song so unique is that it's a companion song. And the next four songs, 77, 78, 79, and 80, are all written together or grouped together because they share the themes of God's power and God's shepherding care. This is really interesting because some of them are written as very powerful, positive praise songs. Some are written like this one in a spirit of despair and in something that's unresolved. But every one of them in Psalm 77 through 80 have this overarching theme that whether we're in good times or difficult times, our only hope and our only security is found in God's powerful hand and God's shepherding care. That's it. It doesn't matter what the circumstances of my life are going to be, regardless of what I'm experiencing in my life, whether it's good times or bad times, whether everything is going well or everything seems against me. The only hope I have, the only security that I have isn't in me, it isn't in the government, it isn't in the circumstances or the culture around. The only hope that you and I have for success in our lives and the ability to thrive in the moment is because of God, his powerful hand and his shepherding care. And this shows up in 77, 78, 79, and 80 in the most interesting ways. In Psalm 77, verse 20, he says, God, you led your people along that road like a flock of sheep with Moses and Aaron as their shepherds. And he's writing and saying, God, you took us through the wilderness and that entire period. You're the one. Even though you appointed Moses and Aaron to serve as under shepherds, you were the one who was shepherding us with your powerful hand and your guiding care. When we get to Psalm 78, we see the same spirit. He says, God chose his servant David, just like in the earlier psalm, God chose Moses and Aaron. Now God chose David, calling him from the sheep pen. David, as a young boy, was a shepherd out in the desert area, taking care of his father's sheep. And God says, David, I'm taking you from the sheepfold, and now I'm going to use you to shepherd my kingdom, my people Israel. And he made David the shepherd of Jacob's descendants, God's own people Israel. And isn't this last sentence interesting? He cared for them with a true heart and led them with skillful hands. Now, in context, it's referring to David as the shepherd. But in the larger, more macro sense, this is what God does for his people. He shepherds us with a true heart and skillful hands. This is pushed even further in Psalm 79 that continues this theme when we read in verse 13. Then, as God is leading us, as God is caring and providing for us, then we, your people, the sheep of your pasture, will thank you forever and ever, praising your greatness from one generation to another. Do you see the theme that God raises up people, but in the big picture, he's the one who's leading. He's the one who's carrying us so that we can praise him. And then in Psalm 80, you have this climactic, almost prayer when we read in verse 1 and 2, please listen, O shepherd of Israel, you who lead Joseph's descendants like a flock, O God. Display your radiant glory. Show us your mighty power. And so the important fact is that regardless of our circumstances, whether it was Asaph who was writing 3,000 years ago, or you and I living our lives every single day, God gave us this collection of songs from 77 to 80 to remind us that in every circumstance of our life, whether it's comfortable, convenient, and fun, or difficult, challenging, and almost desperate, God is the one who carries us. God is the one who leads us. God is the one who provides. So I can rest. Now, as we're looking at the song as it's printed in your Bible, there are 5 sections. There are 5 stanzas, but in those 5 stanzas, there are only 2 dominant themes. The sections, if you're looking at them, and you'll see a space between the verses that separate the stanzas. Verses 1 through 3, 4 through 9, 10 to 12, 13 to 15, and 16 to 20. But all of those separate stanzas all can be boiled down to 2 dominant themes. The first, in verses 1 through 9, is this sense of personal desperation. It's not just discouragement, it's more than that. His back is against the wall and there's nowhere else to go. He's crying. He's literally screaming out to God, do something, do something. I can't take this. But then in verse 10, the whole mood of the song changes. And equally, as much as he's in despair, now we see Asaph writing from a spirit of hope, a sense of promise that God is going to take care of us, that God is going to provide, that by his, and we're going to see 3 things in a little while that carry us and help us to thrive spiritually. Before we get there, let's look at the first half. It starts in verses 1 through 9 with a sense of personal despair. And right from the starting gate, he comes out full bore, not just expressing discouragement, but despair. Notice in verse 1, I cried out to God for help. I cried out to God to hear me. Now, in the Hebrew language, this verb, I cried out to God, is written twice, not just once, but twice in a row. And it amplifies, it forces us to sense the intensity of the problem that he's going through. I like some of the other translations to see how they dealt with that double verb where he's crying out. In the Christian Standard Bible and the ESV, the English Standard Version, it says, I cry aloud to God, and he'll hear me. In the New Living Translation, I especially like this one. I cry out to God. Yes, I shout. Oh, that God would listen to me. Man, what a sense of helplessness and hopelessness and despair. He pushes even farther to help us understand this spirit, this moment of desperation when he says, when I was in distress. And the word distress is really interesting. In the Hebrew language, it literally says narrows. When I was in the narrows. It's an idiom. The same way that we would say, I was in a tight spot. There was nothing I could do. Now, look, each of us have our own unique personality types and strengths and weaknesses. And some of us, and I find, look, I'll be absolutely honest with you. I am not mechanical at all. I don't know how to fix a car. I feel like I've done a pretty good job just pumping gas. I'm not kidding. At home, I'm not a handyman. I am not. I don't know one end of the hammer from another, all right? The truth is, when Krista and I got married, she had more power tools than I did, all right? The reality is, but what I do, I'm a fixer. When there's an issue going on, I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to push. But the reality is sometimes those of us who are fixers find ourselves in a place where we can't change the situation. Doesn't matter what we try. Doesn't matter what we do. When we're in the narrows and our back is against the wall, you can't just kick in and say, oh, we'll figure this out. We're going to get through this. Every one of us at times are like Asaph. Our back is against the wall. We're in the narrows. And even when people come alongside us and say, oh, it's going to work out. It's going to be okay. The last line. I would not. I refuse to be comforted. All these people who come alongside, oh, don't worry, we'll get through it. No, doesn't do any good. Have you ever been in that spot? And it's so interesting. We don't know the circumstances. We don't know why he's right. And I think that that's a help for us because we can personalize this more. For some, it's going to be their work. For some, it's going to be their health. For some, it's going to be their marriage. Some, it's going to be their finances. Some, it'll be another relational issue. But no matter what we do, our back is against the wall, and we don't feel just discouraged. We feel in despair. We don't know how to deal with it. We're helpless to change it. And all we can do is cry out to God, sometimes shouting, God, what are you doing? The hard part is when we're shouting to God and there's no answer back. And you sense from the punchiness of the verbs that follow that he's in this place where there's nothing that Asaph can do. I remembered, I groaned, I meditated, my spirit grew faint. You kept my eyes from closing. I couldn't even speak. Wow. And when you're in that place, and your back's against the wall, you're in the narrows, and there's nothing you can do to change or fix the problem, you start to think back. Better times. I thought about the former days, the years long ago. I remembered the good times when I would sing at night. And then Asaph asks a list of rhetorical questions. They're pretty brutal questions when you look at them. He said, I started asking, will the Lord reject us forever? Is he never going to show us favor again? Has his unfailing love completely vanished forever? Has his promises failed for all time? Has God forgotten how to be merciful? Has he stopped being compassionate and just angry? Somebody once said that sometimes in order to get pertinent answers, you have to ask impertinent questions. And it almost feels like Asaph is asking a list of impertinent questions. What's wrong? Don't you trust God? I love the fact that God's shoulders are big enough to handle it when we come and we're struggling. He remembers our frame. He knows that we're dust. John chapter 11, Lazarus has died. Martha had already sent Jesus a note saying, hey, you need to come, solve the problem. The one you love is dying. He needs your help. You need to fix the problem. Jesus waits until he knows that Lazarus is gone, and then he comes. And then as he's walking up the path to the house, Martha comes running out and blasts him, just clobbers him. This is your fault. If you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Whoa. Martha, don't you know you're talking to God? You don't talk to God like that. Asaph, don't you know you're talking to God? You don't talk to God like that. But God's, it's okay. It's okay. And any of us who have ever been in that place where it feels like our backs are against the wall, everything is against us, and even God seems to have abandoned us, we find ourselves in the same place at times, asking the same questions, haven't we? One of the great Bible scholars, H.C. Leipold, takes all these questions, these impertinent questions, and bundles them all together and says, can't we all relate to this at times? Why does God let things go on as long and as tragically as they do without giving any tokens of his interest or concern for our lives? There are people here who either have personally dealt with or in your family have dealt with some debilitating illness, a disease. It just doesn't go away. A financial struggle that just doesn't stop. A work relational problem, a marriage relational problem, some other issue, and it just keeps going. And we cry out to God. We shout to him. Maybe if I shout a little louder, he'll hear me. And it seems like it just doesn't go away. It doesn't stop. Oh, God, what's wrong? Don't you care anymore? And this is even compounded by the fact that sometimes, and this is even harder for me, is the fact that sometimes we know all the answers academically. We know all the theological points about God, and we can define all these attributes, and we can explain all these amazing things, and we know truth, but we don't feel it. We don't experience it. It's even more complicated when some of us, by personality type, are already given to melancholy. Now, if you're a sanguine person and you're in the Narrows, you're going to get through this guy, hey, somehow it's all going to work out and we can still have fun. Somebody who's more of a choleric personality says, somehow we're going to push our way through it. But people who are more melancholy by nature, who already live half of their life under a cloud just because of their personality wiring, they come to this point and they say, wow, I already struggle with the melancholy of depression. And added to this, it feels like God doesn't even care. What do you do? And this happens to godly people just as much as it happens to the heathen. And it's even more difficult when it's the godly person who's struggling with all of this. We're all familiar with the name Charles Spurgeon. Charles Spurgeon lived from 1834 to 1892. One of the most famous pastors in all of evangelical church history. In fact, he was the pastor of the Metropolitan Tabernacle for 38 years. One of the greatest preachers in the history of the church. In fact, he was so dynamic in his Bible exposition and preaching, he was actually called in his generation and still the Prince of Preachers. When people would go to the Metropolitan Tabernacle to hear a Spurgeon speak, they sat absolutely spellbound listening to him. And you look at a guy like Spurgeon and go, whoa, now there's a guy who's got it all together. Whoa, his life must really be good. God really smiles on a guy like that, right? He probably doesn't have any problems and difficulties. But did you know that through almost in the entire adult life, Spurgeon struggled with neuralgia and gout? And both of those are conditions that cause all of your joints to swell up and be in pain. In fact, because of the neuralgia and the gout, he was regularly, almost daily, swollen red. His limbs were painful. His appendages were in so much pain that he couldn't walk. He couldn't even write. And on top of that, he had constant migraine headaches that caused him to not even be able to get out of bed. Over and over and day after day, he was in this kind of physical condition. And on top of all of that, he had a natural melancholy. And when these things hit, and he would call out to God, and he'd say, God, help me, God, heal me. And there was no answer. The overwhelming struggles, along with his natural melancholy, led him to absolute despair. Absolute despair. No one would read through his sermons or his expositions of the Psalms and go, now there's a guy who is hurting every day of his life. One of Spurgeon's greatest works was an exposition of the Psalms, all 150 Psalms. It's so interesting that when he came to Psalm 77 and he heard Asaph crying out to God because there is something that God isn't dealing with, that God isn't answering, I want you to hear how Spurgeon felt when he wrote about Psalm 77. And the language that he uses, the English language, is a little bit different than the way we might say stuff. So I'll kind of pause and add some stuff, but I want you to sense the spirit of desperation and almost despair as he is writing about Psalm 77 and his personal identification with Asaph. He said, some of us know what it is, both physically and spiritually, to be compelled to use these words that Asaph is writing. No respite, no break, no change has been afforded to us by the silence of the night. We cry out to God, God doesn't change it. God doesn't answer. Our bed The bed that I'm laying on is nothing more than a rack. Do you remember what the rack is? It's an instrument of torture. They would stretch people out, tie them, and then they'd stretch them. And he said, my bed is nothing but an instrument of torture for me. Our body's been in torment. Our spirit is in anguish. Alas, my God, the writer, and he's not talking about Asaph, he's talking about himself here. Alas, my God, the writer of this exposition of Psalm 77 knows well what thy servant Asaph meant. For his soul, not referring to Asaph, but himself, my soul is familiar with the way of grief. Deep glens and lonely caves of soul depressions. My spirit knows full well of your awful glooms. Wow. Maybe you're there right now and nobody else knows about it. Some of us are here and we're having the best week of our lives. I'm so excited. My kids are here, grandkids are here, and oh man, I'm flying today. But somebody else may be on the opposite side of the spectrum, and nobody else knows. You came into church, we had a greeting time. Hey, how you doing? Your instant response was, oh, I'm doing great, but inside you're dying. Dying. Is there any answer? Is there any hope for us when we're in that place? Asaph says, yes, absolutely. There is hope. And he pushes us. Now in verse 10, all of a sudden, everything starts changing. The focus shifts from this person who's in trouble and pain and desperation and all the struggles, and it completely changes. And in verses 10 through 20, we see the answer to the problem. And I love it. He sends, again, in this terse, punchy way. In verse 10, I thought, or I decided, I remember, I will consider, I will meditate. He says, look, if you're in that place and you feel in a moment of despair and helplessness that nothing is good and there is no hope, you have to change your focus. You have to. And what Asaph is saying here in the strongest imperative terms is, I will intentionally change my focus. I will focus my thoughts. And he says this in verse 10 when he says, then I thought, this is what I'm going to appeal to, or this is what I'm going to remember and focus. And he gives us three answers, not just to help us survive, but he tells us how to thrive even in those difficult, painful moments of our lives. He says, this is it. In the dark days, when it seems so hopeless, we must choose to focus on the greatness of three things. The greatness of God's character, the greatness of God's strength, and the greatness of God's guiding care. This is it. You can't just say, well, it's going to be one or the other. All three. Asaph gives us the answer from God. God is saying, if you're in the pit right now, if you're struggling, or on those days when you are, these are the three things you must intentionally focus on. God's character, God's strength, and God's guiding care. He does this in the most powerful way. When he starts to focus on God's character, he says, oh God, your ways are holy. Typically, when we think of the holiness of God, we're talking about God's isolation from sin, his absolute separation from any moral darkness. But here, when Asaph uses the term holiness, he's referring to the sum total of God's moral attributes. And we know this because he pushes, and I love this poetry as we've talked about synonymous poetry. Sometimes it's the second phrase is saying the first, but this is what we call enhanced parallelism, where he gives us a statement and then he makes it even bigger. He says, oh God, your ways are holy. But then he pushes, and what God is as great as our God? It's not just about holiness proper. He's saying, what God is as good and loving as our God? What God is as merciful as our God? What God is as gracious as our God? Oh God, when I think about the sum total of everything you are, I am overwhelmed. And it's so much greater than the problem. Have you ever done that? I mean, seriously, have you ever just in the middle of a challenge, stepped back, because if we just keep going and focusing on the problem, all we're going to do is loop and loop and loop, and in that rut, we never change. But sometimes when we just step back and say, wow, isn't God amazing? Isn't God great? And you start thinking about the goodness and the grace and the love and the mercy of God. You go, oh, wow. Oh, God, you are so much bigger and greater than the problem. And then he pushes, and it's not just enough to focus on the greatness of God's character. You also have to focus on the greatness of God's strength. And here, notice how he uses in this parallelism. I'm going to remember the deeds of the Lord. I'm going to remember the miracles of long ago. I'm going to remember and consider your works and all of your mighty deeds. Oh, God, the way you've won victory after victory after victory. You've proven yourself over and over and over again. He pushes even farther. You're the God who performs miracles. You're the God who displays your power among the people. You're the one with a mighty arm that redeems or delivers your people. Wow! And then he pushes into examples by nature that are pictures of the greatness of God's power. The water saw you, and very clearly he's going back to the deliverance or the redemption of Israel from Egypt as God took them through the Red Sea. The water saw you, God. The water saw you and writhed. The very depths were convulsed. The clouds poured down. The heavens resounded with thunder. Arrows of the lightning flashed back and forth. Verse 18 is my favorite, though. Your thunder was heard in the whirlwind. Now, that is a poetic translation, not a literal translation. The literal translation in the Hebrew says, your thunderous roar was in your chariot wheels. Now, if you don't understand that, that's a picture of battle. And usually it was the army that had the most chariots that was the victorious one. And God gets in his chariot when he goes to battle for his people, and all of a sudden there is a roar from the wheels, and you go, God is on the move. God is on the move. And when God goes into battle for his people, God is always victorious. It doesn't matter how many chariots the world has, the culture has, or the problem might be. When God goes to war for his people, he's always victorious. Always. And it doesn't matter how big the problem, our God is bigger. It doesn't matter how severe and depressing the circumstances may be, our God always rides into battle with hope. Man alive, when you consider that, all the victories, when you're in that place and it feels so overwhelming, Asaph is just saying, just recount all the times in your life that God has proved himself by giving you victory. Do you think the God who didn't go to war for you then doesn't care for you and won't go to war for you now? No. No. And if that's not enough, the greatness of God's character and attributes, the greatness of God's strength and the victories that he wins, and then he pushes us to the third thing that we have to deliberately, intentionally focus on, and that is God's guiding care. And this is where the shepherding concept comes in. He says, oh God, your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters, even though your footprints weren't seen. Another way for us to say that would be, oh God, you led your people through the waters even though we couldn't see your feet. And everywhere that God led them, he provided. Everywhere that he led them was a good place because he was always with them. When God is leading us, sometimes it's not going to make sense. God's going to say, here, this is my plan for your life. I'm going to take you places you would have never imagined going on your own, but this is my special purpose and plan for your life, for your church, for the kingdom. And when God leads us, he always goes with us. And he always provides. And he uses people of encouragement in our lives like Moses and Aaron and pastors and elders and mentors in our spiritual life. But God is always moving. God is always leading. And when we're obedient and submissive, God says, don't worry about the circumstances. Don't worry about this situation. You put your trust in me. You choose to focus on my character, my strength, and my guiding care. And that pushes us to this point today for every one of us, whether individually or corporately as a church. When we're in a situation that seems overwhelming and the circumstances of our lives are uncertain and they're the dark moments of our lives and times, what do we choose to focus on? If you choose to focus on the problem, all you're going to do is get that rut deeper and deeper and deeper, and you're going to loop and loop and loop. But when you intentionally choose to focus on the greatness of God's character, the greatness of his strength, and the greatness of his guiding hand, that's when we're going to be pulled out of the pit and into praise. Now, this is true on both a personal level as well as a corporate church level. And I want to take just a minute and share with you. Earlier I said, I am so excited that after 10 years, God's leading us, and now we're going to start a building program. But this is a big, challenging program for us as a church. This is the biggest thing that's happened since we've moved here. It is well over $3 million that we're going to be investing into this building. And it was only a week ago when somebody asked me, and again, sometimes you ask impertinent questions to get pertinent answers. And somebody said, Steve, let me just be honest and say, I can't imagine, I do not understand why in an economy where we're dealing with all this inflation and everything is so uncertain now, why in the world are you even beginning a building program in a time like this in our economy and culture? It was a fair question, I thought. Challenging question, but fair. What would cause, and it felt to him like this is presumption that we would start a $3 million plus building program when people are struggling with jobs, when you can hardly afford to buy gas and food and all the rest of it. And they're looking at me and said, do you have an answer for this? I said, yeah, I do. I do. The reality is we've been praying about this for more than 10 years, saying, God, we need a building that is adequate for our building. Nothing extravagant, but a building that's adequate for the ministry that you want to build here. We have been growing our family ministry, and I know during the summer there's more space, but when our children's ministry is at the point where we're out of space now, and we have to tell people, I'm sorry, you can't come to our program. We're closing the doors and saying, this is it. We've been saying, God, you're the one who's going to have to provide. And all of a sudden, not only has God given us a building plan that makes sense, it will meet our needs, he's also provided the funds. And through the gifts that have been committed by people like yourselves, we are at a point now where when all of this is done, with the gifts and the commitments and the one-time things that you've already done, our whole mortgage is only going to go up about $1,000 a month. That's a miracle that God has provided this much money for us in commitments and already one-time gifts. And even more importantly, we have prayed about this, the leadership, the church, we have all prayed about it. We've said, God, we don't want to presume. We want to make sure that we're in your will. Are you leading us? And with absolute affirmation of the congregation in our voting and our commitments, we have said collectively, we believe that God is leading us to do this. And even in an uncertain economy, God already knew all of this was going to happen. I don't have to worry. This is not my battle. If we're going to be victorious, it's only going to be because of the greatness of God's character, not ours. It's only going to be because God is strong in battle, not because we're so wealthy. And it's only going to be because God is leading us. And I think that it's important for us at this moment, before we even launch the first shovel to be turned, that it would be good for us just to take a moment and step back and get everything in perspective, so that we're not going, oh, no, this is going to be so terrible. Oh, what are we going to do? What happens if? We need to remind ourselves that God is great in character. He's great in power, and He's great as He leads us. And the way that I want to do that is show you again the video that we created of the history of Village Church. God has been leading Village Church for 140 years. 140 years. And He's provided for all of our needs. And God has been at work in powerful ways, bringing people into the kingdom. And so I think it would be great for us just to take a moment and remind ourselves of what God has done at Village Church and what He's going to continue to do as we walk forward in faith. So watch on the screen with me. We're going to use the same song that we started our service with, and I have to apologize for the people who are watching online because we have to kill the volume of the song or Facebook will flag us and we'll get bumped off. So watch as we remember what God has done and doing. Isn't that great? Folks, listen. Every single picture you just saw is a reminder of God's character, His strength, and His ability to lead us. And whether it's in our individual lives or in the corporate life of Village Church, our single response then is to say, we're going to live by faith. We're going to live by faith, not by sight, but by faith, because we serve a great God. Amen? That's the way I want to live my life every day, don't you? Amen. You can applaud God. It's just great. So let's take a moment and just affirm our dependence on a great God. Father, thank you.